December 7, 1941, 6 a.m. 230 miles north of Oahu. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the pitching deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi as the first wave of aircraft prepared for launch. Around him, the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled steamed through the pre-dawn darkness. 6 carriers, over 400 aircraft, the culmination of months of planning and years of preparation. Fuchida had been hand-picked to lead the air attack. At 39 years old, he was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced aviators. He had flown in China. He had studied American tactics. He understood what this mission meant, not just tactically but strategically. Success would cripple the American Pacific Fleet. Failure would doom Japan to a war it couldn't win. As his Nakajima B-5N bomber was positioned on the flight deck, Fuchida looked at the faces of the pilots around him. Young men, most in their early 20s, they showed no fear, only determination. They had trained for this moment. They believed in their emperor, their nation, their divine mission to lead Asia. They were convinced of Japanese superiority, certain that American softness and decadence made them vulnerable. At 6:15 a.m., the first aircraft launched. Fuchida's bomber roared down Akagi's deck and lifted into the darkness. Behind him, wave after wave of aircraft followed. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, 183 aircraft in the first wave. Another 167 would follow. The greatest carrier airstrike ever attempted was underway. As they flew south toward Oahu, Fuchida couldn't know that he was leading Japan toward destruction. The attack would succeed beyond expectations. American ships would burn. Thousands would die. Japan would achieve tactical surprise that military planners dream of, but that success would seal Japan's fate. The sleeping giant would awaken furious. And 4 years later, Fuchida would watch his nation's cities burn under American bombs. This is the story of Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective, how the attack was planned and executed, what the pilots saw and felt, how victory became the first step toward catastrophic defeat, and how pride, confidence, and belief in cultural superiority blinded an entire nation to the consequences of their actions. To understand Pearl Harbor, you must understand how Japan arrived at the decision to attack. The path began not in 1941, but a decade earlier with Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. That aggression marked the beginning of Japan's attempt to create an Asian empire, what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The name was propaganda. The reality was brutal conquest. Japan's military leadership believed expansion was necessary for survival. The home islands lacked natural resources. Oil, rubber, iron, and food had to be imported. During the 1930s, as Japan's economy grew and its military modernized, dependence on foreign resources increased. Most critically, Japan imported 80% of its oil, primarily from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. The invasion of China in 1937 deepened this dependency while increasing resource consumption. The war in China was supposed to be quick. It became a quagmire. Japanese forces controlled cities and railways but couldn't pacify the countryside. Millions of Chinese civilians died. Japanese casualties mounted. The war consumed resources faster than conquest could provide them. American response was initially limited to protests and minor sanctions, but as Japanese atrocities in China became known, particularly after the rape of Nanking in 1937-38, American public opinion hardened. The Roosevelt administration began restricting exports to Japan. First aviation fuel, then scrap metal, then more comprehensive trade limitations. By 1940, relations were deteriorating rapidly. The fundamental problem was irreconcilable strategic objectives. The United States demanded Japan withdraw from China and abandon expansionist policies. Japan refused to relinquish conquests and considered American demands humiliating interference. Diplomatic negotiations continued throughout 1941, but both sides knew war was increasingly likely. Japan's military planners faced a dilemma. Continuing war in China required resources Japan didn't have. The oil-rich Dutch East Indies and resource-rich Southeast Asia were tempting targets, but seizing them meant war with Britain, the Netherlands, and almost certainly the United States. Japan's navy could defeat any single opponent, but America's industrial capacity meant any prolonged war would end in Japanese defeat. The solution proposed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was audacious. Strike the American Pacific Fleet preemptively. Destroy American battleships in a single attack. This would buy Japan 6 months to a year to consolidate conquests in Southeast Asia. During that time, Japan would create a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to break. Faced with years of grinding warfare, America might negotiate a settlement recognizing Japanese conquests. The plan had a fatal flaw that Yamamoto himself recognized. It assumed America would behave rationally, calculating costs versus benefits and accepting negotiated peace. But Yamamoto had lived in America. He understood American character better than most Japanese leaders. He privately expressed doubt that America would accept defeat, famously stating that attacking America would awaken a sleeping giant. But when ordered to plan an operation against Pearl Harbor, he did so brilliantly. The planning began in early 1941. The challenges were immense. Pearl Harbor was thousands of miles from Japan, beyond normal operational range for carrier aircraft. The harbor was shallow, making conventional aerial torpedoes ineffective. American forces, while not on full war alert, weren't completely unprepared. Any attack would require achieving complete surprise against a defended target. Japanese naval aviation was, in 1941, the finest in the world. The pilots were superbly trained, with many combat veterans from China. The aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, were world-class. The carriers were modern and well-equipped. Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive action, concentration of force, and decisive battle. Everything pointed toward making Yamamoto's audacious plan feasible. The technical problems were solved through innovation and intensive training. Special aerial torpedoes were developed with wooden fins that allowed them to run in shallow water. Armor-piercing bombs were created by modifying 16-inch naval shells. Pilots trained for months, practicing low-level torpedo attacks and high-altitude bombing. The most skilled aviators in the Imperial Navy were assigned to the operation. Security was absolute. The attack plan was known to only a handful of officers until shortly before execution. The strike force assembled at Hitakapu Bay in the remote Kuril Islands. Far from observation, radio operators remained aboard carriers in home waters, transmitting normal traffic to disguise the fleet's absence. The route to Hawaii crossed the empty North Pacific in winter, avoiding normal shipping lanes. On November 26, the strike force departed. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Huryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and support vessels. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the fleet, though Fuchida would lead the air attack. As they steamed eastward, pilots were finally briefed on their target. The reaction was euphoria mixed with apprehension. They were striking the most powerful blow in naval history. They were also committing an act that would determine their nation's fate. The fleet maintained absolute radio silence. Refueling operations were conducted in heavy seas, dangerous work that claimed no casualties but demonstrated the professionalism of Japanese naval crews. Lookouts scanned constantly for American patrol aircraft or ships. None appeared. The North Pacific in December was empty. Luck favored the attackers. By December 6th, the strike force was in position 230 miles north of Oahu. Final reconnaissance confirmed the American fleet was in harbor. 7 battleships were moored along Battleship Row. 1, Pennsylvania, was in dry dock. Heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels crowded the harbor. The only significant absence was the American carriers, which were at sea delivering aircraft to island bases. The absence of carriers troubled some Japanese planners. Carriers were the future of naval warfare, and missing them meant leaving a threat intact. But the primary targets were battleships, which American doctrine considered the decisive weapons. Destroying them would cripple American offensive capability for at least a year. That was the theory. December 7th began for the attack force at 5:30 a.m. when crews were awakened. Pilots ate a special breakfast, many drinking sake and eating traditional foods. Some wrote final letters home, though most expected to survive. The Japanese plan didn't contemplate suicide attacks. This was a military operation, not a sacrificial mission. But everyone understood that combat meant risks, and some wouldn't return. Fuchida dressed carefully in his flight suit, including a red shirt that would make him easily identifiable to his pilots. As air commander, he needed to be visible. He carried a sword, more symbolic than practical, and photographs of his family. At 39, he was older than most pilots and felt responsible for the young men he would lead into combat. The first wave began launching at 6:00 a.m. The carriers turned into the wind, and aircraft roared off the decks into darkness that was beginning to lighten in the east. 43 fighters to establish air superiority. 49 high-level bombers carrying armor-piercing bombs for battleships. 51 dive bombers to attack airfields and cruisers. 40 torpedo bombers to strike battleships and carriers. Fuchida's bomber would coordinate the attack and assess damage. The flight south took over an hour and a half. The pilots flew in tight formation through scattered clouds. As dawn broke, they could see Oahu ahead, green mountains rising from blue ocean. Honolulu's lights were visible. Everything appeared peaceful. There were no American patrol aircraft, no indication they had been detected. The attack would achieve complete surprise. At 7:40 a.m., Fuchida transmitted the code phrase Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. It meant surprise had been achieved. The message was received by the strike force and relayed to Tokyo. Japan's leaders, waiting anxiously thousands of miles away, now knew the attack was proceeding. There was no turning back. At 7:48 a.m., the first bombs fell on Wheeler Field, an Army Air Force base in central Oahu. The American aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip, grouped together to prevent sabotage. This made them perfect targets. Strafing Zeros and dive bombers swept across the field, destroying aircraft on the ground before they could launch. Pilots ran toward their planes and died in the attacks. Within minutes, dozens of American fighters and bombers were burning. Simultaneously, torpedo bombers swept into Pearl Harbor from multiple directions. The attack plan was choreographed precisely. Each pilot knew his target and approach path. The first torpedoes struck battleships on Battleship Row at 7:50 a.m. USS Oklahoma took 3 torpedoes on her port side in quick succession. She began listing immediately. USS West Virginia absorbed multiple torpedoes and started settling into the harbor mud. USS California was hit twice and began flooding uncontrollably. The high-level bombers arrived seconds later. Fuchida's group approached from 10,000 feet, targeting the battleships with armor-piercing bombs. The bombs fell for long seconds, growing smaller as they dropped. Then massive explosions erupted as they struck. These weren't conventional bombs but modified 16-inch naval shells designed to penetrate armored decks. They punched through USS Arizona's deck and detonated in her forward magazine. The explosion was cataclysmic. Over 1,000 tons of gunpowder erupted simultaneously. Arizona's forward section disintegrated. The explosion was visible across Oahu, a massive fireball rising hundreds of feet. The shock wave overturned small boats in the harbor. 1,177 men died instantly. Arizona settled to the harbor bottom, her burning superstructure remaining above water. It took less than 9 minutes from the first hit to her destruction. From his aircraft, Fuchida watched in awe and horror. He had expected destruction, but not this. The battleship had simply ceased to exist as a fighting vessel. Fires raged across the harbor. Ships were capsizing. The neat rows of battleships were becoming chaos. and the attack was only beginning. Dive bombers screamed down on other targets. USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a priority target. If she escaped to the open ocean, she might survive. Japanese pilots concentrated on her, multiple bombs striking as she attempted to reach the harbor entrance. Rather than let her sink in the channel and block the harbor, her captain deliberately beached her. She would survive but was out of action. USS Oklahoma capsized at 8:08 a.m., 20 minutes after the first torpedo hit. Over 400 men were trapped inside as she rolled. Some would survive for days in air pockets before rescue crews cut through the hull. Others drowned immediately. The capsized hull became a temporary tomb, rescue efforts continuing for weeks after the attack. The surprise was so complete that organized resistance took time to develop. Individual sailors manned anti-aircraft guns, firing at Japanese aircraft without central coordination. Some hit their targets. Japanese losses began mounting as American defenses awakened. But for the first 20 minutes, Japanese aircraft operated with near impunity. American fighter pilots who managed to reach their aircraft found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Zero was superior to anything America had in Hawaii. Japanese pilots with combat experience from China shot down the few American fighters that got airborne. The air superiority phase of the attack was one-sided. By 8:30 a.m., Japanese aircraft controlled the skies over Oahu. The second wave arrived at 8:40 a.m. Another 167 aircraft, 54 bombers, 78 dive bombers, 35 fighters. Their mission was to attack targets missed by the first wave and finish damaged ships. They found a far more alert defense. Anti-aircraft fire was heavy and accurate. American gunners, having had time to man their stations, put up withering fire. Second wave losses were significantly higher. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led the second wave. He observed the destruction from the first attack and directed his forces accordingly. But the targets were obscured by smoke. Ships were burning or sinking. The harbor was covered in oil fires. Identifying specific ships became difficult. The second wave's effectiveness was reduced by the chaos the first wave had created. By 9:00 a.m., smoke from burning ships and fuel oil created a pall over Pearl Harbor. Japanese pilots had difficulty observing damage and selecting targets. Some attacked the same ships multiple times. Others shifted to secondary targets like dry docks and repair facilities. The Nevada, beached and burning, received additional attention. The Japanese wanted her completely destroyed. Fuchida circled over the harbor for nearly 2 hours, coordinating attacks and assessing damage. What he saw exceeded the most optimistic planning estimates. 5 battleships were sunk or sinking. 3 more were damaged. Multiple cruisers and destroyers had been hit. The harbor was an inferno. American naval power in the Pacific appeared to be destroyed. But Fuchida also noted significant failures. The American carriers were absent. The massive oil storage tanks on the shore were undamaged. The repair facilities and dry docks, while hit, were not destroyed. The submarine base was largely intact. These omissions would prove critical. The American fleet could be repaired, refueled, and rebuilt. But in the euphoria of success, few Japanese commanders recognized what they had failed to destroy. The last Japanese aircraft departed around 9:45 a.m. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours. As they flew north to the carriers, pilots were exuberant. They had achieved complete tactical surprise. They had destroyed the American battle line. Japanese losses were minimal: 29 aircraft lost, 74 damaged, 129 dead. American losses were catastrophic: 2,403 dead, 1,178 wounded, 5 battleships sunk, 3 damaged, multiple other vessels destroyed or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed. When the strike force recovered its aircraft and reported to Admiral Nagumo, Fuchida and other air commanders urged a third strike. They wanted to destroy the oil storage, repair facilities, and anything else of value. Some argued for remaining in Hawaiian waters to hunt the American carriers, but Nagumo refused. The primary mission was accomplished. American battleships were destroyed. Further risk wasn't justified. The fleet would return to Japan. This decision would be debated for decades. A third strike might have destroyed facilities essential to American recovery. Hunting the carriers might have eliminated the forces that would soon strike back at Japan. But Nagumo's caution was understandable. He had achieved the mission's objectives. His forces were deep in enemy waters. American carriers were somewhere nearby. Remaining risked the strike force for marginal additional gains. The fleet steamed west at high speed. American search aircraft found nothing. The Japanese force melted into the vastness of the Pacific. By December 10th, they were beyond American reach. On December 23rd, they arrived in Japanese waters to tumultuous welcomes. The pilots were national heroes. Fuchida was promoted and decorated. Japan celebrated the greatest naval victory in its history. In Tokyo, military and civilian leaders were euphoric. The attack had succeeded beyond expectations. America's Pacific Fleet was crippled. Japan's conquests in Southeast Asia proceeded with minimal naval opposition. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies all fell rapidly. By March 1942, Japan controlled a vast empire spanning much of the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The war appeared to be won. But voices of caution were drowned by celebration. Yamamoto warned that Japan had awakened America's wrath and had perhaps 6 months before American industrial might made itself felt. A few strategists noted that American carriers remained operational and that American submarines would threaten Japanese shipping. Some recognized that destroying battleships while leaving repair facilities intact was a partial victory. These warnings were ignored. The Japanese perspective was shaped by cultural factors that Western observers often misunderstood. The concept of Yamato Damashia, the Japanese spirit, held that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantages. Many Japanese leaders believed that American softness and lack of fighting spirit would prevent them from prosecuting a long war. They assumed America, faced with costly battles for isolated Pacific islands, would eventually negotiate. This fundamental misunderstanding of American character was perhaps Japan's greatest strategic error. Americans did not see Pearl Harbor as a tactical defeat to be accepted. They saw it as treachery requiring vengeance. The attack had occurred before Japan's declaration of war reached Washington, making it appear as a sneak attack. "Remember Pearl Harbor" became a rallying cry that unified American purpose in ways Japanese planners never anticipated. For the individual pilots, the immediate aftermath was glory. Fuchida became a celebrity, giving lectures on the attack and training new pilots. He believed Japan had achieved decisive advantage. He trusted his leaders' assurances that America would be unable to counterattack effectively for at least a year. By then, Japan would have consolidated its defenses and made any American offensive prohibitively costly. The first cracks in this confidence appeared remarkably quickly. In April 1942, barely 4 months after Pearl Harbor, American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet struck Tokyo in the Doolittle raid. The damage was negligible, but the psychological impact was enormous. The sacred home islands had been attacked. American carriers had operated with impunity in Japanese waters. The immunity Japanese propagandists promised did not exist. Fuchida missed the Battle of Midway in June 1942 due to an emergency appendectomy. He watched from Akaga's sick bay as his ship was hit by American dive bombers and set ablaze. The carrier he had launched from at Pearl Harbor burned and had to be scuttled. 3 other carriers were also destroyed. Japan lost 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and most critically, irreplaceable experienced pilots. The battle lasted 5 minutes, and the course of the Pacific War reversed. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive. The pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, supremely confident in December 1941, now faced an enemy growing stronger while Japanese resources dwindled. Fuchida flew combat missions through 1942 and into 1943, watching as pilot quality declined, as fuel shortages limited training, as American aircraft improved while Japanese design stagnated. By 1944, the war was clearly lost. American forces advanced across the Pacific in two axes, Central Pacific island hopping and Southwest Pacific advances. Each battle cost Japan aircraft and pilots it couldn't replace. The experienced veterans of Pearl Harbor were mostly dead, replaced by teenagers with minimal training. The Zero fighter, dominant in 1941, was outclassed by American Hellcats and Corsairs. Fuchida survived because of his experience and luck. He was assigned to staff positions after being wounded in 1944. He watched Japan's situation deteriorate from headquarters, understanding what frontline pilots were experiencing but unable to change the outcome. The industrial juggernaut Yamamoto had warned about had materialized. American shipyards produced carriers in months. American factories built aircraft by the thousands. Japanese production couldn't match these numbers. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan intensified in 1944 and 1945. B-29 superfortresses firebombed Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The raids Fuchida had helped initiate by attacking Pearl Harbor had come home with interest. Tokyo burned. Osaka burned. Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, city after city was devastated. The proud nation that had celebrated victory in December 1940, one was dying under American bombs. Fuchida was at Hiroshima in August 1945, assigned to Army headquarters. He left the city the day before the atomic bomb fell, perhaps the luckiest moment of a lucky life. He returned days later to survey the devastation. The city was gone, tens of thousands dead in an instant. He understood then that Japan had lost not just the war but its future. The pride that had driven the Pearl Harbor attack had led to this apocalypse. After Japan's surrender, Fuchida had time to reflect on what Pearl Harbor had achieved. The tactical success was undeniable. As a military operation, it was brilliantly executed, but strategically, it was catastrophic. It united America against Japan. It ensured America would fight total war until Japan surrendered unconditionally. It triggered the industrial and military mobilization that destroyed Japan. The attack that was supposed to buy Japan time instead sealed its fate. In post-war interviews and writings, Fuchida was remarkably candid about these conclusions. He acknowledged that Pearl Harbor's success contained the seeds of defeat. Sinking battleships while missing carriers meant attacking obsolete weapons while leaving the future instruments of naval warfare intact. Failing to destroy oil storage and repair facilities meant the ships that survived could be quickly restored. Achieving surprise but failing to follow through with subsequent attacks allowed America to recover faster than anticipated. More fundamentally, Fuchida came to understand that no tactical victory could overcome strategic impossibility. Japan lacked the resources to fight prolonged war against America. The assumption that America would negotiate after suffering setbacks was fantasy. American character, American industrial capacity, American determination all made Japanese victory impossible. Pearl Harbor didn't change this. It just made the inevitable defeat more complete and catastrophic. The human cost of this strategic failure was staggering. Over 3 million Japanese died in the war, most of them after Pearl Harbor. Japanese cities were destroyed. The economy was devastated. The military was disbanded. The emperor's divinity was renounced. Everything Pearl Harbor was supposed to prevent happened anyway, in far worse form than diplomatic settlement would have imposed. For the pilots who survived the war, the aftermath was complicated. They had done their duty as they understood it. They had fought skillfully and bravely, but their skill had served a cause that was morally bankrupt and strategically doomed. Processing this reality took years. Some never fully reconciled what they had done with what it had caused. Fuchida's post-war life took an unexpected turn. In 1950, He converted to Christianity after reading about Jacob de Chazer, an American Doolittle raid pilot who had been captured and tortured, but later forgave his captors and became a missionary to Japan. Fuchida became a Christian missionary himself, preaching reconciliation and peace. The warrior who led the attack on Pearl Harbor spent his final decades advocating forgiveness and religious faith. His conversion was controversial. Many Japanese saw it as rejection of Japanese identity and culture. Some accused him of abandoning his comrades' memory. Others viewed it as genuine spiritual transformation. Fuchida traveled to America multiple times, speaking about his experiences and his changed perspective. He died in 1976, still working to build bridges between former enemies. The broader lessons of Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective are sobering. The attack demonstrated that tactical brilliance cannot overcome strategic foolishness, that cultural arrogance blinds nations to reality, that surprise attacks, while militarily effective, can have political consequences that negate military advantages, and that wars begun in pride often end in catastrophe. Japan in 1941 believed in its superiority, culturally, militarily, spiritually. The stunning success at Pearl Harbor seemed to confirm this belief. Japanese forces swept across Asia and the Pacific, defeating Western powers with embarrassing ease. The myth of invincibility was reinforced by every victory, but the myth was always false. It was based on catching enemies unprepared, on fighting nations weakened by years of war in Europe, on temporary advantages that couldn't be sustained. The American response demonstrated that democracies, while slow to anger, are terrible enemies once committed. The industrial capacity that Japanese planners dismissed as soft consumer economy transformed into war production that buried Japan under material. The American fighting spirit that Japanese propaganda portrayed as weak proved resolute and vengeful. The racist assumptions that Japanese superiority would overcome American diversity proved catastrophically wrong. For individual Japanese pilots, the journey from Pearl Harbor to surrender was gradual disillusionment. The euphoria of December 1941 gave way to frustration at Midway, concern during the Solomons Campaign, fear during the 1944 defeats, and despair by 1945. Each step showed that the promises of victory were lies. Each loss demonstrated that America wasn't negotiating. Each bombing raid proved that Japan's home islands weren't invulnerable. The technical lessons were equally stark. In 1941, Japanese naval aviation was superior. By 1943, it was equal. By 1944, it was inferior. Not because Japanese technology regressed, but because American technology advanced faster. Japanese industry couldn't produce enough aircraft. Japanese training programs couldn't replace experienced pilots. Japanese tactics, doctrine, and equipment all stagnated, while American equivalents improved continuously. The human cost of this trajectory was borne by the pilots themselves. The men who attacked Pearl Harbor were elite professionals. They were replaced by competent regulars, then by marginally trained volunteers, finally by teenagers given bare minimum instruction before being sent into combat. The learning curve that made Japanese pilots formidable in 1941 couldn't be replicated as losses mounted. Experienced pilots died and took their knowledge with them. By 1945, Japanese pilots were conducting suicide attacks because conventional tactics no longer worked. The kamikaze program was admission that Japan couldn't win through skill and training. Turning pilots into guided missiles was desperation dressed as ideology. The pilots of Pearl Harbor would have been horrified by kamikaze tactics, but by 1945, there was no alternative. Skill couldn't overcome American numbers and technology. Sacrifice was all that remained. Fuchida survived to see this transformation and understood its meaning. The proud warriors who had attacked Pearl Harbor had been reduced to desperate children flying to certain death. The navy that had been the finest in the world was destroyed. The nation they had fought for was occupied and transformed. Everything the attack was supposed to protect was lost. The pride that drove them to Pearl Harbor had led to this complete catastrophe. In his later writings, Fuchida was remarkably honest about these conclusions. He didn't claim Pearl Harbor was necessary or justified. He didn't argue that better tactics or more determination could have changed outcomes. He acknowledged that Japan had started a war it couldn't win, based on assumptions that were false, driven by pride that blinded leaders to reality. The attack succeeded tactically and failed strategically, and that contradiction defined his life. The final assessment of Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective must acknowledge both the military excellence and the strategic bankruptcy. As a military operation, Pearl Harbor was superbly executed. The planning, training, and execution all demonstrated professionalism of the highest order. Japanese naval aviation in December 1940 was performing at a level few forces ever achieve. The pilots were skilled, brave, and effective. But this excellence served a cause that was doomed from the start. Japan couldn't defeat America. The resource disparity was too great. The industrial advantage was too significant. The geographic challenges were insurmountable. Even perfect execution of military operations couldn't overcome these fundamental realities. Pearl Harbor bought Japan 6 months of victories followed by 3.5 years of defeats culminating in atomic bombs and unconditional surrender. For Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who led the attack, the journey from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima was a journey from pride to humility. The confident warrior of December 1940 became the reflective convert of the 1950s. He lived long enough to understand that his greatest military success had contributed to his nation's greatest catastrophe. He spent his final decades trying to build peace between enemies, trying to prevent others from making the mistakes he had made. The lesson his life teaches is simple but profound. Military victory without strategic wisdom is empty. Tactical brilliance without understanding consequences is dangerous. Pride that blinds nations to reality leads to catastrophe. Pearl Harbor was all of these things. It was brilliantly executed disaster. It was success that guaranteed failure. It was the attack that won a battle and lost a war, that destroyed a fleet and doomed an empire, that demonstrated excellence while ensuring catastrophe. When Fuchida transmitted Tora, Tora, Tora on December 7, 1941, he thought he was announcing Japan's greatest victory. He didn't know he was announcing the beginning of Japan's road to destruction. The pride he felt that morning would take 4 years and millions of lives to transform into the understanding he gained later. Pearl Harbor was the moment Japan's fate was sealed, though it appeared to be the moment of Japan's triumph. Pride truly did come before the fall, and the fall was total.